So let's now discuss the concept of homeostasis, which is the understanding of the concept of homeostasis should make the best sense when we have a good understanding of cellular stress, and we will have a good understanding of cellular stress if we have also a good understanding of homeostasis. And these two concepts are inseparable, as we mentioned earlier, because homeostasis is maintained by active cellular mechanisms, biochemical pathways that require ATP, and these mechanisms work diligently to ward off and protect the cell from cellular stress. And cellular stress succeeds if it causes a deviation in the state of homeostasis. So what does homeostasis mean? What does homeostasis mean? Homeo means the same. Stasis means stable, which means staying stable by staying the same, being stable by staying the same. And that should be very intuitive for us, because if we look at this colorful diagram over here, we see that there is a range. This green range, we'll refer to it as the homeostatic range. It has an upper maximal limit, upper tolerable maximal limit, and it has the lowest tolerable limit for all the variables that the intercellular life deals with. So one variable is pH. So there is the lowest possible pH level below which the cell will suffer from acidosis, or the body will suffer from acidosis. The maximum level above which the body will suffer from alkalosis. Another variable is temperature. Above a certain temperature, the cell will undergo cell injury. It might even die, and these very important enzymes will denature and the cellular organelles will fall apart. And there is a maximal lower temperature below which the cell will definitely be injured. Another variable is, for example, blood glucose level. There is a highest amount of tolerable glucose level in the body, above which we will suffer from hyperglycemia. There is a lower limit. Below which we will suffer from hypoglycemia. Now, this is the homeostatic range that is maintained by the physiologic systems, and the cell will undergo structural and functional changes to fight any stressor that tries to deviate or push the cell above the maximal or below the minimal amount, or below the minimal tolerable level. Now, let's go back to homeostasis. We said homeostasis means being stable by staying the same. So, what is the more practical definition of homeostasis? Homeostasis is maintaining a constant internal environment and being able to carry out all the internal physiologic and structural biochemical pathways that enable the cell to maintain a constant internal environment, leading to its survival and being viable against all the external stressors and internal perturbations and stressors. So we can break down homeostasis into four concepts. homeostasis is a state of constant internal environment. What's a state? A state is a form. It is the optimal form in which the enzymes required for essential life processes are able to carry out and catalyze the reactions in which they participate, leading to the cell's survival. And constant, meaning homeostasis, is very expensive because it requires a lot of work and a lot of energy in order to maintain homeostasis, and requires a lot of work to resist any change in homeostasis, and requires a lot of work to resist any stressor that tries to deviate the homeostatic range in which the cell survives, because cellular stress will eventually lead to cell injury and then cell death, and that will progress to move up the scale from an injured cell to a impaired tissue, to impaired organ system, to the appearance of clinical symptoms and signs that might exacerbate and lead to the death of the individual if the clinical situation isn't rectified and remedied. But we covered what a state is. It's the optimal form of existence for the cell, and constant, meaning this homeostasis isn't a natural thing. It is the natural state upon which the cell exists, but it doesn't happen naturally or simultaneously. It happens actively due to requirements of energy requirements that cause the cell to survive within that range. And internal, why internal? Because we are talking about the core, or the cells and the tissues and the organs which are situated inside, situated within. So we have an optimal state of existence that is maintained by resisting stress or challenges that come from the outside environment or the inside. And internal because the form of existence for the cell happens situated within the body. And environment, meaning that this homeostasis is achieved by a setting in which there is physical, chemical, and biological, physical, chemical, and biological systems working in a balanced and working in unison to provide for the cells this range of homeostasis upon which it can survive. So how is homeostasis maintained? We mentioned variables that must be kept within range. So in order to maintain homeostasis, the body is equipped with three parameters. The first parameter, for each variable, there is a sensor that senses if there is an increase in the if there is an increase in the variable, or it will sense if there is a decrease below the level, if there is an increase above the level or a decrease below the level for each variable. This sensor will send a signal to a control center. The control center will understand whether or not there is a decrease below the homeostatic range, this optimal range, or if there is an increase above that optimal range. Then the control system will send the proper message to the effector. It's called an effector because it does the effect of repairing the problem. Then after the problem is repaired, the sensor will sense that we have returned, whether we were below this minimal, acceptable, tolerable range, or if we return back to this acceptable homeostasis range, then there will be a negative feedback where the control system will no longer send the signal that caused the change. So let's give an example. Let's talk about the temperature as a parameter. Let's say there is a drop in temperature below the least acceptable temperature for the body. So now we will feel very cold. So there are thermal receptors in the skin and the spinal cord that detect a change in temperature below the lowest optimal tolerable acceptable range. So they will send these receptors, these sensors, they will send these thermoreceptors, they will send a signal to the control system, which for the variable of temperature, the control system is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will send a signal to the skeletal muscles. So now the effector is the skeletal muscles. The skeletal muscles will now use chemical energy in the form of ATP and convert chemical energy in the form of ATP to kinetic energy in the form of shivering, in the form of motion. So this conversion of ATP by the skeletal muscles into motion, into energy of motion, will cause the dissipating of heat and will cause energy to show up as heat, and that will make us warm, and that will return us back to the acceptable range of homeostasis. So here the sensor in a situation where the cell went, where the variable temperature went beyond the least acceptable range, the sensor was a thermoreceptor. It sent a signal to the control system, which was the hypothalamus, which is the thermostat of the body, and the effector was the skeletal muscle. What did the skeletal muscle do? It did what is called shivering thermogenesis, where energy, as the first law of thermodynamics says, energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it can shift from a form to the other. So here there was a shift in a change in the form of energy, from energy in the form of ATP, which is abundant in the body, generated by oxidative phosphorylation, as we mentioned earlier in the mitochondria. This change of ATP into this chemical energy in the form of ATP has been converted to energy in the form of motion, energy of motion, or kinetic energy, and this change of energy has caused the dissipation or the showing up of heat that caused us to be warm and brought us back to the normal state of homeostasis. What if there was the opposite? What if the temperature went above this highest acceptable range, where we feel very hot? What does the body do? I'm sorry, there was another example during the temperature when it is below the lowest acceptable and tolerable limit. And we talked about shivering thermogenesis. There's another example called non-shivering thermogenesis, where brown adipose tissue is broken down and is involved in the process of shifting, also oxidative phosphorylation, and changing the proton motive force and causing the energy that is also in the form of ATP to appear as an energy in the form of heat. Now, let's talk about when it's very hot, when temperature has increased above. Now, it's not below, it's no longer below the least tolerable limit. Now it's above the highest tolerable limit. What does the body do to maintain homeostasis? Again, thermoreceptors in the skin and the spinal cord will detect this roaring or increasing temperature, this increasing raise in temperature, and it will send a signal to the hypothalamus, but the effector will be the sweat glands. Sweat glands will secrete sweat, and what is the most prevalent substance in sweat? It's water, and water has a very high specific heat capacity. So now, since we were very hot, that means the core is very hot because the weather was hot and the air is hot. Now the heat flew from area of higher concentration to our core, an area of lower concentration, which made us hot. Now this secretion of sweat has now caused a third parameter in our equation. Before it was the hot air and our core. Now there is a third place, and that is the sweat or the water, which is the major substance in sweat. What happens is water will now flow from our core, I'm sorry, not water, heat. This hot and this heat will flow from our core into the sweat. And when the heat moves from area of higher concentration in this example, which one is hotter? Hotter. Which one is more hot? Where is the most amount of heat? In our core or in the sweat and water? Obviously in the water and the sweat. So the heat will move from our core to the sweat, and heating up the sweat, causing the sweat to evaporate. And this is called evaporative cooling. So now we gotten rid of this really hot core by dissipating the heat to the sweat and causing the water to evaporate in expense for taking the heat from our core and causing the water to evaporate. And it also works in the other direction. When the heat strikes our skin, it does not reach our core as it used to before the secretion of the sweat. Now the heat in the air will have to first deal with this insulating layer of sweat and cause that sweat to evaporate before it can reach our skin. So it's working in both directions. The sweat is sucking, or for lack of a better word, taking this heat from our core, and is also taking the heat from the external environment, causing a drop in our core temperature and a drop in the temperature that is in direct contact with our skin. So here the sensor was the thermoreceptors, the control system was the hypothalamus, but the effectors were different. But the variable was the same, and that is the temperature. I would like to give another brief example of homeostasis, and that is blood glucose. You see, if blood glucose has increased above the highest tolerable limit, this is called hyperglycemia. So now there will be a sensation that glucose has increased to more than the highest tolerable and highest acceptable amount in the blood. So the sensation will now go to the control system. The control system in this case is not the hypothalamus. It is the beta cells of the pancreas. They are the ones who sensed and detected there is an increase in the glucose in the blood glucose, and they will end up releasing the essential hormone insulin. and at the same time they inhibit these beta cells of the pancreas. The beta cells of the pancreas, they secrete insulin and they inhibit the alpha cells of the pancreas. So they work as yin yang. So there is an increase in blood glucose hyperglycemia that would lead to a sensation of this increase in blood glucose by the beta cells of the pancreas. The beta cells of the pancreas will inhibit the alpha cells of the pancreas from releasing the hormone glucagon, and they will release insulin. What is the effector? The effector here is the skeletal muscles, fat cells, and the liver cells. So what does insulin do? The insulin will cause the skeletal muscles, the liver, and the fat cells to uptake this glucose from the blood. So the liver will uptake this glucose and it will convert it to glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose, and it will convert glucose to triglycerides that will later be stored in the adipose tissue, and the skeletal muscle cells will also uptake this glucose, leading to an overall reduction in serum, in blood glucose, and bringing us back from a state of hyperglycemia into a state of euglycemia, or the state of the normal range of blood glucose. So here the sensor was the beta cell of the pancreas. The beta cell of the pancreas released insulin. Insulin caused the effector, being this is no longer it's no longer sweat glands. It has nothing to do with shivering thermogenesis. Now our variable is different. Our variable is an increase in blood glucose. So the effectors are how do you spell skeletal muscle cells that uptake this glucose, and liver cells that uptake the glucose, convert it to glycogen and fatty acid triglycerides that will be stored in fat cells. And this storage and uptake of glucose would reduce the overall amount of glucose in the blood. Now the opposite. Let's say there is a drop, a severe drop in the level of glucose in our body. The sensor here will be the alpha cells of the pancreas. And the first thing they will do is they will inhibit the beta cells of the pancreas from releasing insulin. And the alpha cells of the pancreas will now release glucagon, which does the opposite of insulin. Here, we don't have the proper amount of the adequate amount of glucose in the body. Now we need to increase it. And glucagon is a catabolic hormone that causes a breakdown in the glycogen storage in the liver. So a process known as glycogenolysis, where glucagon will stimulate the liver to break down these storage molecules of glycogen, break down these belts and release glucose into the body, and cause the skeletal muscle cells to release glucose in the body. Not only that, not only will glucagon cause the liver to release glucose in the body and bring us up from a state of hypoglycemia to a state of hyperglycemia, but glucagon will stimulate the liver also to create glucose from non-carbohydrate precursors in a process known as gluconeogenesis, where amino acids are used and lactate is used to create glucose and dump this glucose in the blood and rescue us from going into a state of injury and bringing us back to euglycemia or the normal range of homeostasis. So here we saw two different mechanisms where there is a sensation that there is a disturbance in homeostasis, whether an increase or a decrease, and then a control center detected that variable. By the way, there are control centers that regulate more than one variable. We only discussed a control center that regulates temperature, one variable, or temperature or glucose level, one variable. There are other control systems like angiotensin, renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. It controls two variables, but we will talk about that another time. The last thing I wanted to say was glucagon was an enzyme, a hormone that is catabolic, while insulin is anabolic. Insulin leads to the buildup and the uptake of glucose and building up glycogen, while glucagon is catabolic. It leads to the breakdown of glycogen into monomers, into glucose, and releasing it into the body. So this is how we maintain a state of homeostasis. You see all of these control centers, all of these activities, signal transduction, communication with effectors, they require energy, and they require very important biochemical pathways for our survival. Okay, now we talked about homeostasis. Now we will talk about the stressors from the perspective of where they originate from. There are stressors that originate from inside the cell, and there are stressors that originate from the outside of the cell. Stressors that originate from the inside of the cell are genetic abnormalities, where there is a mutation leading to the expression of leading to a defect in the expression of hemoglobin, as in the case of sickle cell anemia. And in the case of sickle cell anemia, there is an inability for hemoglobin to uptake oxygen, leading to a deficiency in the supply of leading to a deficiency of oxygen in the blood. There's another example of genetic abnormality, and that could be very conspicuous, as in the case of trisomy 21. In the case of trisomy 21, there is an intellectual disability and growth impairment caused by the showing up of an additional copy in the chromosome 21. So instead of having 2 copies in chromosome 21, we have 3 copies in chromosome 21, leading to this genetic abnormality, leading to a genetic disorder known as Down syndrome. So genetic abnormalities can lead to subtle changes, leading to, for example, a defect in the inability to generate the enzyme required for a particular process, or a genetic abnormality in the form of non-disjunction, or maybe trisomy 21. Another example of an internal cause of a stressor that it originates from the inside is an immunologic reaction, as in an autoimmune disease. As in an